Hello and welcome to another edition of the book review here at CCXP Exam Simulator. This is Michael Bartlett, and today I'm going to review The Control Heuristic, The Nature of Human Behavior by Luca Dellanna. I first became aware of Luca at the recent Nudgestock 2020 conference that was held recently in June, and reached out to Luca because he mentioned that he had a new book coming out, and I was able to obtain an advance copy. So it's very insightful. I ended up with quite a lot of notes, but I've tried to condense it down into my top 10 takeaways. So the first takeaway is he talks about coherence and the decentralized brain framework. Now basically what he means by decentralized brain framework is we have different regions throughout the brain that kind of do different things, and obviously some of those can take direct sensory input, from our eyes, from our sense of smell, whatever, but then there are other regions that rely on the output of some regions as well. So if for example you think you see something and you're not actually seeing what you think you are, like you might see a stick on the ground and you might think it's a snake, then that part of your brain will pass that information on to your amygdala and other regions of the brain that there's a snake on the ground. So you can see how delusions and illusions can be created in the mind because lots of different regions rely on the outputs of other regions, and of course they can be faulty. So coherence basically means having a coherent view of the world. And sometimes what happens is you can get what we call local coherence. So different parts of the brain are happy with the information they have, but then when you take all of that up to the global level, suddenly you have something that doesn't make any sense. And so the brain has to figure out a way of dealing with that. So that's where narratives come in. And Luca basically says that narratives get confabulated when there's local coherence but global incoherence. It's basically like cognitive dissonance. The brain has to come up with an explanation, and so that's why it creates narratives. He says that we are made to act. Action is the filter that separates useless patterns from meaningful ones. And so essentially all creatures from the moment they're born, the more actions they take, the more decisions they take, the more feedback they're going to get from the environment. Therefore, the more they can start to filter that information and thus create, useful actions, not so useful actions, useful patterns and meaningful patterns and useless patterns as well. So that's essentially what the made to act theory means. His idea of expected emotional outcome is one of the central themes of the book, and essentially what it means is whenever we think about taking a decision, our brains create an expected emotional outcome to it. So let me give you an example. There was a famous task done once. I think I actually read about it in the book Descartes' Error by Antonio Damasio. And the task is called the Iowa gambling task. And what they did is they provided 2 decks of cards, I believe, I could be wrong, but I think it was 2 decks of cards, and they rigged one of the cards. And then they were asking people to bet based on, what was happening with the results of the cards when they were being drawn. And what happened is people started to cotton on to the fact that one of the decks of cards wasn't being particularly kind to them, but they couldn't really explain it. It was more just a feeling, like a gut feeling, and that essentially is what expected emotional outcome is. It's not something that we think we're rationally evaluating things, but a lot of this stuff happens under the hood. And essentially if you've got a number of different options, you'll normally, the one that has the highest emotional outcome is normally the one that you will take. However, there is a caveat to that, and that is that sometimes the one that you decide is the best expected emotional outcome will still result in non-action. Basically, you could think of that as where you've got like a few options, but none of them are great. And that's because there's a theory that says that the basal ganglia will inhibit any actions, and it won't allow the movement to happen if it doesn't feel the expected emotional outcome is over a certain threshold. And that's where Luca brings in the idea of gating theory. And it's quite fascinating because he shows how so much of the brain ultimately has connections that go outwards to the motor side, but the basal ganglia is absolutely responsible for inhibiting those actions. So it ties in really nicely with his theory of expected emotional outcome. He talks about proxies and the potential for illusions of a shortcut. So let me give you a quick example with this one. Imagine that there's an organism and one of its goals is to reproduce and pass on its genes. So let's take the example of just a young man. So the young man wants to do that. So if you think about all of the steps that are needed to get there, and we take it step by step, nice and slowly. You'd have spend time around, and meet lots of young women, lots of attractive women, get to know them, see what you've got in common, and you go down the thread until eventually you get to a relationship, and then obviously having a family. And so what Luke is saying is that sometimes our brains can mistake some of the steps in that plan, if you will, as the actual activity itself. It creates a proxy for it. So what that means is you'll have a lot of people doing the proxy thinking that ultimately it's going to give them the same illusion of reproducing and passing on their genes, but actually it isn't. You might waste a lot of time hanging out with a lot of people who are friend zoning you, so to speak. So this is where the idea of proxies come in. I thought that was a rather interesting way of explaining away some rather unusual behaviors that people might have. He talks about the control heuristic, which of course he named the book after, and he says we behave to feel that we are controlling risks. And this takes a risk-based view of human behavior, where he says each commercial transaction can be seen as a risk transfer. So let's imagine that I'm out and about and it's a hot day and my blood sugar's running low and I get a craving to eat some Starburst or drink a sugary drink, for example. So I look at the price, I pick a drink. In my mind, what's essentially happening is I've made a selection, so I've had a number of options. I've had an expected emotional outcome attached to those options. The basal ganglia has basically allowed one of those actions to take priority and has allowed it through, because it ultimately thinks that even though I'm paying money, which is painful to the human mind, the reward is going to be, the overall net result is going to be worth doing for the body. It's going to move me away from risk, and so that's why we see it as a risk transfer. He talks about values, and he says values are buckets in which we categorize actions and the people who took them. He said they're not necessarily the cause. Really what values are the narratives that we create. He said any actions that you take, remember, any actions that you take are because they have a high expected emotional outcome. And then the final point he makes was moods allow us to adapt to environments in which resources are clustered. This was really fantastic. As you can see from the book, everything that he presents has an evolutionary underpinning to it. But this was one of the most fantastic takeaways from the book for me, because it explains why people can get into good moods and bad moods and why we even have them. And he's referencing a particular paper in his book, but the example he gives is someone that's foraging for food. If there's a little area where there's not much food and they forage again, the mood is going to dissuade them from expending all unnecessary energy, because things really aren't going well for them, but they'll save energy in the long run. Whereas if they're in an area where they're foraging and they're finding something, then they find something else, then they find something else, then it's creating extra additional motivation, driving them to take those actions. Essentially, if you think about it, it's attaching a high expected emotional outcome to those actions, because essentially it wants them to keep going. And his theory, which is, because it comes from another paper, but the theory is that that's why we have moods, is because it allowed us to have that little bit of extra either motivation or demotivation when we were in environments in which resources were clustered. So I thought this was a fantastic book. As he says in the subtitle, this is about the nature of human behavior, and it has such a fantastic explanation for lots of different types of behaviors. For example, he even explains why we have storytelling and why we have narratives. The expected emotional outcome, if you want to think about it in simplistic terms, is basically like pleasure minus pain, and then whatever that result is the expected emotional outcome. But as we know from behavioral economics and well, even storytelling where we put essence onto things, you know, like for example, a wedding ring, your original wedding ring, you're always going to value a lot higher than any kind of replica wedding ring. And I think they did experiments where they told kids they could clone their toys, and the kids would always pick the original toy rather than the clone, even though they were the same. So it takes into consideration all those kind of things: storytelling, essence, you know, loss aversion, the fact that, you know, we see losses twice as heavily as we do gains, and all of that can be just wrapped up into it creates an expected emotional outcome, and the action with the highest expected emotional outcome is likely to happen if the gating theory allows it through. So I hope that all makes sense. You need to really pick the book up though and get in depth yourself and have a look at it, because there's so much information here. Lucas spent such a long time putting this together. The amount of research that went into this book is phenomenal, so I take my hat off to him. I think he's right up there with Rory Sutherland in terms of just being one of the great thinkers in this domain. So go out and get this book. It is highly recommended. So that's all from me. If there's any other books that you would like to see reviewed, drop me a line and I will be back with actually a book compare and contrast soon. I'm doing a review between two books on storytelling, so I'll have that out in the next few days. All right, thanks and take care until next time. Bye-bye.